My name is Reed Warner. I'm 48 years old, and I run a consulting firm that helps corporations with strategic decision-making. I've spent the better part of my life learning how to control the environment around me, how to predict outcomes, and how to stay 2 steps ahead. I come from a strict upbringing, where emotions were a luxury no one could afford. My father didn't believe in soft words. Everything had a purpose, and if you didn't deliver, you were forgotten. It's a lesson I've carried with me through every decision, every contract, and every interaction. I can't say I ever like to talk much. My work speaks for itself. When people need something done, they come to me. There's no room for second-guessing, no time for mistakes. I'm methodical, everything in its place, everything accounted for. My team, small but efficient, knows their roles and does their job. Marissa, my wife, has always been a different story. We met early, when I was still figuring out what I wanted to do after the military. She was softer, more flexible than me, more emotional, I suppose. And that, in a way, was what drew me to her. She wasn't like the others who saw the world as just a series of calculated moves. Marissa's spontaneity had a certain charm. But as the years went by, I began to see it for what it was: unpredictability. I hadn't always been the best husband. My job took up most of my time, and when I wasn't working, I was thinking about work. I wasn't home much, and when I wasn't exactly present. Marissa took on the brunt of the family responsibilities, as most wives do, and over time, I grew distant, not out of malice, but out of focus. I had a plan, a vision, but in the process, I forgot about the people who should have mattered most. Our house, in a quiet suburban neighborhood, was always immaculate. Marissa had done that. It was the kind of house where everything was in its place, like an exhibit of what life could look like if you just followed the rules. But even with all that order, things didn't feel right. I noticed it most when we went on our family vacation last summer. We had a week planned in the mountains, an escape from the daily grind. I figured it would be a good chance to reconnect, to put aside the business for a while. But as we packed up the car, I could tell something was off. Marissa wasn't herself. She moved slowly, listlessly, almost as if she didn't want to go at all. I said nothing, just grabbed the bags and loaded the car. She didn't meet my eyes much that morning. Her gaze drifted out the window, distracted. I figured it was just stress. During the drive, Marissa was quieter than usual, which wasn't unusual. She often preferred to keep to herself in the car, but this felt different. When we stopped for gas, I noticed she didn't ask me if she could drive, like she normally did. That might have been nothing, but the more I thought about it, the more it nagged at me. She was always so eager to take control of small things like that. This time, she sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window. I didn't bring it up then, not in front of the kids. But later that night, when the kids had gone to bed, I sat down with her on the porch. The air was cool, and the trees rustled in the wind. We didn't speak at first. It wasn't until the silence became heavy that I asked, "What's going on with you, Marissa? You've been off for weeks." She shifted in her chair, the old wooden one creaking under her. She didn't look at me. "Nothing. I'm just tired. It's been a long few months." Her voice was soft, but there was something else there, something I couldn't pinpoint. I looked at her, really looked at her. She wasn't the same person she had been when we first married. That spark, the one that had always been there, had faded. It wasn't the exhaustion of motherhood, the way she had sometimes explained it. This felt different. She'd been distant for a while now, but I couldn't afford to acknowledge it. Not just yet. I had too much going on at work, too many things I needed to control. The next morning, things were the same. She was quieter than usual, but I brushed it off. It wasn't until later that evening, after we'd settled into the cabin, that I saw something that made me pause. She was scrolling through her phone, her thumb moving quickly across the screen. When I walked past her, she quickly turned the screen away, almost like she was hiding something. I didn't ask her about it right then. I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The nagging thought that there was something she wasn't telling me grew stronger. The next day, I saw the name Seth on the screen of her phone while she was in the kitchen. She didn't notice me watching, but I saw it clear as day. Seth. I didn't know anyone by that name, and I didn't recognize it from her work contacts. I made a mental note of it, but didn't bring it up. Not yet. It could have been nothing, but then again, I wasn't in the business of ignoring things that didn't add up. That night, I didn't sleep much. I could hear her soft breathing beside me, but the room felt cold. Not physically, but emotionally. Something had shifted, and I wasn't sure where it was going, but I knew I had to start paying attention. What I didn't know then was how much I would need to pay attention and how soon it would all come crashing down. The next few days dragged on, each one feeling heavier than the last. Marissa became even more distant. She started spending more time on her phone, and I could hear her talking in low tones late at night when I was in the study. I'd catch bits of conversations, but the moment I walked into the room, she'd fall silent, pretending she was reading or looking at something important. It wasn't the kind of silence I could ignore anymore. It wasn't just the usual exhaustion. There was a disconnection that wasn't there before. I decided to confront her. Not with accusations, not with anger, just facts. One evening, after dinner, I sat down across from her at the kitchen table. The kids were in bed, and the house was quiet. I knew this was the moment. "Marissa," I said, keeping my voice even, "you've been acting different lately. What's going on?" She looked up at me, eyes wide for a second, like she was trying to come up with an excuse, then sighed and leaned back in her chair. "I don't know, Reed. It's just a lot, okay? The kids, the house. It's just been wearing me out." Her voice was tired, like she was telling me something I should already know. But I wasn't buying it. It was too rehearsed. I didn't say anything right away. I just stared at her, waiting for more. There was no use in pushing if she wasn't going to give me the truth. But I knew the truth was there, just out of reach. I'd felt it for weeks, and now it was close enough to touch. "Is there someone else, Marissa?" I asked quietly. I didn't raise my voice, didn't need to. The words hung between us, heavy. She didn't answer right away, her eyes flicking to the side, then back to me. She stopped herself and looked down at the table, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee mug. "Yes, but it's not what you think." She spoke so softly that I almost didn't hear it, but the words hit me like a punch to the gut. "Who?" I asked, calm but firm. It was a simple question. She hesitated, then sighed, clearly defeated. "Seth," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's been someone I've been talking to. It's not like it sounds, Reed. It's just that. I don't know. He listens. He makes me feel like I'm not just a mother or a wife. I've felt so invisible, and he... You've been seeing him for how long?" I interrupted, cutting off her excuse. It wasn't the first time I'd heard this story from her, but hearing it out loud was different. She shifted in her chair, clearly uncomfortable now. "A few months. It just happened." Her hands fidgeted, pulling at the fabric of her shirt. I didn't mean for it to go this far. Her words were weak, but I wasn't interested in what she meant or didn't mean. I was interested in the facts. I stood up from the table, pacing a few steps before stopping. "You're telling me that after everything, after the life we've built, this is how you choose to deal with things?" I said, voice flat. It wasn't anger, it was just understanding the situation for what it was. She had chosen to find someone else to fill a void I didn't even know existed until now. "I didn't know how to talk to you, Reed," she said, almost pleading. "You're always so focused. So distant. I needed something. Someone who could see me, who could what?" I cut in. "Make you feel wanted?" I shook my head slowly. "You think I don't see you, Marissa? You think I don't see everything you've done? This isn't about what I've done or haven't done. It's about what you chose to do. And now, we're here." There was a long silence. Marissa didn't meet my eyes. She knew this wasn't something we could just fix with a conversation, a promise, or a change of routine. This wasn't a mistake or a phase. This was a betrayal, and no matter how much she apologized, that wouldn't change. I didn't say anything more that night. There was nothing left to say. She spent the rest of the evening sitting on the couch, I staring blankly at the TV, but I knew she wasn't watching. I went to bed early, the weight of it all pressing down on me. I had my own plan for how I would deal with this, but for now, I just needed silence. The next few days were a strange sort of dance. Marissa kept trying to talk to me, to explain herself, but every time she opened her mouth, it felt like more excuses. I let her talk, but I didn't listen. I wasn't interested in the why anymore. I was focused on the what. What was next? What was I going to do about it? I didn't let on that I was already 2 steps ahead of her, that I'd already started making arrangements, that I had already begun to calculate the repercussions, not just for her, but for Seth as well. She thought she was still in control, still playing the part of the apologetic wife, but I knew better. This wasn't a moment for weakness or forgiveness. It was a moment to reclaim what was mine, and I wasn't going to waste any more time. I didn't waste any time. Marissa spent the next week trying to pull at the threads of our routine, as though everything could go back to normal if she just apologized enough. But I wasn't interested in apologies or explanations anymore. I needed to take control of the situation, and that meant making sure I was always one step ahead. I wasn't going to let this drag out, not with her or with Seth. I started by quietly rearranging a few things at home. I swapped out the files in her home office with blank ones, papers she'd be expected to present in meetings over the next few weeks. A simple move. It didn't seem like much, but I knew it would plant the seed of doubt in her mind. I knew it would make her question her competence, something I had no interest in doing directly. The seeds would take root soon enough. When I saw her frustrated one afternoon, pacing in her office, muttering to herself about missing reports and forgotten emails, I took a moment to make my presence known. I didn't say anything about the files, not yet. Instead, I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching her fluster. "You're struggling," I said flatly, watching her squirm for a moment. She didn't look up at first, but after a few seconds, she straightened up and wiped her face with her hands. I don't know what's happening. I keep missing things. I'm not getting these right. It's like everything's slipping through my fingers." "You're getting sloppy," I said, my tone calculated, unemotional. "You've always been better than this. Maybe it's time to focus on the things that matter." Her eyes flickered up to mine. "I'm trying," she muttered, but there was no conviction behind it. The more I said, the more she sank into her own guilt. It was clear she knew exactly what she had done, and now I was making sure she knew the consequences were real. I didn't say anything more. I let her stew in her own thoughts. If she wanted to fix it, that was on her. But I had a different agenda. I wasn't interested in her redemption or her apologies. I was interested in securing my position and making sure Seth felt the consequences of his involvement. A few days later, I got in touch with a couple of people I knew from my business dealings. One of them had connections in the local art scene, and I was certain Seth would be vulnerable to that kind of pressure. I didn't want to involve the police or make any scene. I wasn't the type for drama, but I needed to make sure he understood his place. He wasn't some artist in a small studio anymore. He had a name, and that name could mean something, or it could disappear. That wasn't a threat, it was just a reality. I arranged a casual lunch with the contact. He was an old associate, someone I had worked with on a couple of corporate projects. Over a few drinks, I mentioned Seth, not in a way that screamed desperation, but in a way that made it clear I knew exactly who he was. I didn't need to say much. It didn't take long before my associate promised to spread the word about Seth's side hustle, the kind of business deals he was involved in, the kind of deals that didn't hold up well under scrutiny. I didn't need to say any more. If Seth had any sense, he'd figure it out. By the time I returned home that evening, I could see the shift in Marissa. Her phone buzzed constantly now, and she didn't try to hide it as much as she used to. She was getting increasingly jittery. I didn't point it out. I didn't need to. I knew exactly what was happening. The pressure was building on her, and I was just starting. The next morning, I took the kids to school. It was routine. When I got back home, Marissa was standing in the kitchen, looking at me with a strange mixture of guilt and confusion. "Reed," she started, her voice tight. I think I need to talk to you." "About what?" I said, walking past her, uninterested in any further emotional pleas. She hadn't earned that from me. "Seth, he called this morning. He's upset. He says he doesn't understand why everything's falling apart." She seemed almost apologetic, like she wanted me to feel sorry for him. I stopped in the doorway, turned to face her. "What did you expect, Marissa? That he'd stick around when the real cost of your choices showed up?" I took a breath, keeping my voice steady. "You wanted an escape. You got it. Now you're going to deal with the consequences. So is he." She opened her mouth to say something, but I cut her off. "I don't want to hear about him anymore. He made his choice, and now it's time to see how much he really cares. The pressure's on now, Marissa. You've made your bed. You're going to lie in it." I left the kitchen, not waiting for her response. She didn't need to understand the full scope of my plans. She just needed to see that I was no longer emotionally invested in saving her. It wasn't about the marriage anymore. It was about ensuring the people who had made this choice were the ones who felt it the most. As the days passed, I could see the weight of everything starting to crack her. She would stay in her room longer, talking on the phone, her voice anxious as she tried to smooth things over with Seth, but it was already too late. The walls were closing in, and I wasn't about to save her. Not this time. I let her think she still had control for a little while longer, but I knew the inevitable was coming. She would be left alone in the mess she'd made. Just as I had planned. It didn't take long for the tension to build up. Marissa spent more time on the phone, her voice low, almost apologetic, but the cracks were showing. I didn't need to listen to her side of the conversations. The way she jumped whenever I entered the room, the way her phone screen always turned down when I walked past, it told me everything I needed to know. The affair wasn't just a fling anymore. It was something deeper, something she couldn't control anymore. And the moment she realized that was when I moved in for the final piece of the plan. The week following the lunch with my associate was telling. I noticed Seth had begun to retreat. Marissa's texts to him grew less frequent, the calls more strained. She was getting frustrated, and that was exactly what I wanted. I wasn't about to let her get away with trying to salvage something from this. She made a decision, and now she had to live with the consequences. One evening, after I returned home from an off-site meeting, I found Marissa sitting in the living room, holding a cup of coffee in her hands, her fingers trembling. She didn't look up when I entered, but I could tell by the way her shoulders hunched that something had changed. She had the look of someone who had been backed into a corner and knew it. "Reed," she said, her voice tight. I need to talk to you about Seth." I didn't say anything. I just sat down in the armchair across from her, watching her closely. I didn't need to say much. She had already come to the realization that things were unraveling. "I tried to make it work," she continued, her eyes finally meeting mine. There was a hint of desperation in her gaze. "But he's not who I thought he was. He's not dependable. He's been lying to me, and I don't know if I can trust him anymore." I let her finish. Her words didn't surprise me. I knew what was happening before she did. Seth was scared, cornered. The walls were closing in on him, and I had made sure of that. "It's a little too late for that, don't you think?" I said finally, my voice calm and unyielding. She bit her lip, the guilt evident on her face. "I never meant for it to go this far, Reed. It was just that I was so lost. You didn't see me anymore." Her voice faltered, but I didn't respond. I had no use for excuses. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. "Marissa," I said, my tone hard but controlled, "you wanted an escape. You got it. Now you deal with the aftermath. Don't expect me to clean this up for you." I stood up and turned toward the door, not waiting for her to respond. The next morning, as I prepared to leave for another client meeting, I received a call from my associate. "It's done," he said, his voice as dry as usual. "Seth's starting to feel the heat. His business partners are already getting cold feet." Word spreading. I didn't say anything at first. I didn't need to. The results spoke for themselves. "Good," I finally replied. "Let him feel the pressure." I wanted to know exactly what happens when people make bad decisions. I hung up and didn't give it another thought. The situation was under control. I had orchestrated everything perfectly, from Marissa's spiraling self-doubt to Seth's increasing isolation. The chess pieces were in place, and I was playing the game, not with emotion, but with precision. It wasn't personal, it was just the price of betrayal. Later that evening, Marissa came to me again. She had the same nervous look on her face, the one that had been there for the past few days. "Reed, I need to tell you something," she said, almost pleading. I wasn't interested in her confessions anymore. "Just say it," I said, not giving her time to build up to it. "I'm not here to listen to your explanations." I told him. I told Seth that it was over. She took a shaky breath, her hands wringing together in her lap. I didn't want it to go like this. I didn't want to lose everything. I couldn't help but feel a slight shift in the air. Marissa was realizing just how far gone everything was. She wasn't getting out of this unscathed, and deep down, I think she knew it. "You're already lost, Marissa," I said, looking at her for a moment before walking out of the room. "You just haven't figured it out yet." I didn't have to say much. The truth of the situation was sinking in, and Marissa's attempts to salvage what was left were only making it worse. I wasn't going to hold her hand through this. She had made her choice, and now she was going to deal with the consequences. Seth, too, would feel the full weight of it soon enough. The pressure was mounting, and there was no way out for either of them. They had both underestimated the price of their decisions, and they would learn soon enough that there was no escape from the web I had woven. The fallout would be swift, and it would be total. It was time for everything to come crashing down. The days after Marissa's confession felt strangely anticlimactic. I had already seen the writing on the wall, and now I was just waiting for the inevitable. Marissa spent the next week trying to patch things up with me, offering weak apologies that didn't land, pretending like everything could be swept under the rug. But she could tell by my silence that it wasn't going to be that easy. I had already decided that I wasn't going to offer her forgiveness, nor would I try to hold on to something that had clearly slipped away. The tension around the house was palpable, but I kept moving forward with purpose. Work continued as usual, and my team didn't see a difference in my demeanor. They knew me well enough by now. When I was focused, nothing else mattered. Marissa, on the other hand, was unraveling. She spent more time in the house, pacing from room to room, staring out the windows with that lost look on her face. I knew she was trying to figure out what her next move was, but there was no escape. Not this time. I was deliberate in my actions. It wasn't just about Marissa, it was about sending a message. About making sure that anyone who crossed the line with me understood that there were consequences. I made sure to let the right people know about the affair: friends, colleagues, even some of Marissa's family members. It wasn't public knowledge, but there was enough talk in the right circles to make sure Seth felt the pressure. My associate had been right. Word had already spread about his connections and the shady business he had been involved in. His reputation had already started to erode. That was part of the strategy. No one gets to escape unscathed. One morning, after a particularly quiet night, Marissa came to me again, her eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. She tried to speak, but her words were scattered, like she couldn't find the right ones. "Reed," she started, her voice hesitant. "I've been thinking a lot about everything." She paused, searching my face for any sign of understanding. "You've always been the strong one. I don't know if I can fix this." I glanced at her, not out of sympathy, but out of curiosity. "Fix it?" I echoed, keeping my tone even. "There's nothing to fix. You made your choice, and now we deal with the consequences. It's as simple as that." "I didn't mean to hurt you," she whispered, but there was no weight behind it. It wasn't a question anymore. Not really. She knew it was over. "Your words don't matter anymore," I said, finally looking her in the eye. "What matters is what you've done, and how you're going to handle it. But I'm done here. I've moved on." She didn't respond, but I could see it in her face, the realization that there was no coming back from this. I wasn't going to keep her around for appearances. I wasn't going to pretend we were still a family. The truth was, I'd been living in a world of my own for years, and now it was clear to me that Marissa had been playing her own game, but not in a way that could survive under the pressure of reality. Later that afternoon, I got a call from one of my business associates. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Seth's out. He's packing up, leaving town." His voice was flat, businesslike. "I've made sure he understands the consequences of sticking around." I didn't respond immediately. I didn't need to. I already knew what had happened. Seth had been given a choice: leave or face the fallout of his association with Marissa. He had chosen to disappear, his tattoos and his art left behind as a distant memory. It was over for him. But as much as I relished in the finality of it all, I wasn't interested in dragging things out. I was more focused on the future. The next step. What mattered now was moving forward, keeping my focus sharp. I didn't need the distraction of a broken marriage or the mess Marissa had left behind. I spent the next few days putting everything in place, focusing on my work, attending meetings, making sure that the consulting firm was operating at full capacity. I didn't need the extra baggage, and I wasn't going to let anyone see me flinch. My reputation, my business, it was all still intact. Marissa, on the other hand, was left to figure out what came next. I didn't offer to help. I didn't offer comfort. She had made her decision, and now she was going to have to live with it. She spent her days packing up her things, moving out quietly, not a word between us. I made the necessary calls to get the house on the market, and once everything was settled, I started thinking about what came next for me. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about taking control. Marissa had chosen her path, and now I was focused on carving out my own. My future, one that didn't include her, was already in motion. She could figure out the mess she'd left behind, but I had no interest in being part of it anymore. I met with a few potential clients over the following weeks. Business was booming, and my firm was growing steadily. I knew the direction I wanted to take, and I wasn't going to let anything or anyone derail it. Marissa's absence was a minor blip in my world, something that wouldn't even register once the dust settled. I'd always been good at compartmentalizing. The fallout from my personal life was just that, a piece of the past that had no bearing on what I was building now. As for Marissa, she left quietly, just like Seth. She tried to reach out a few times, but I never responded. There was nothing to say. She had chosen her escape, and I had chosen mine. The only difference was that I wasn't running from the consequences, I was running towards something bigger. And I was in control. A few weeks after Marissa moved out, I found myself in a different place, figuratively and literally. The house was quiet now, emptier, but somehow it felt more like mine than it ever had before. I'd always been the one in control of the day-to-day, but now there was a finality to it, a sharp clarity that came with the absence of her presence. I could focus on what really mattered, my work, my clients, the future. Everything else was just noise that I'd long since tuned out. I was sitting at my desk one morning, reviewing some proposals, when my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen. It was a text from Marissa. It had been a while since I'd heard from her, and I had no intention of engaging in any kind of back and forth. But something in the tone of her message caught my attention. "I hope you're doing well, Reed. I just wanted to let you know that I've left the city. I'm staying with my sister for now. I've been thinking a lot about everything, and I think I'm finally ready to start over. I'm sorry for everything. I hope you find peace." It was as expected, nothing I hadn't heard 100 times before. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say anymore. The next few days passed without any real interruption. I had meetings, calls, more work to get through. I stayed on top of things. My team continued to excel, and business was thriving. I hadn't even noticed how quickly the world around me had moved on. What mattered now was building on what I had, what I controlled. I wasn't looking back. It was during a business trip to a small rural town that I ran into Allison. I wasn't expecting to meet anyone new, not on this trip. But as fate would have it, I walked into a local cafe and saw her sitting at a table, nursing a cup of coffee. She had a calmness about her, an ease that I hadn't realized I'd missed until that moment. She was reading something, some medical journal, I noticed as I walked past. I didn't think much of it at first, but as I ordered my coffee, our eyes met for a brief second. She smiled, a quiet, knowing kind of smile. I nodded in acknowledgement and went about my business. Later, as I sat down at another table, I noticed she had moved to the seat beside me. She wasn't pushy about it, but there was a natural ease to the way she struck up a conversation. "I couldn't help but notice the way you were looking at that report," she said, her voice low and steady, without any pretension. "You looked like someone who's always 2 steps ahead." I wasn't used to people noticing things like that, but I appreciated the way she spoke, directly, without any need to make small talk. "I suppose I try to keep ahead of the curve," I said, tapping the edge of my coffee cup, careful to keep my voice measured. "It's a habit I've developed over the years." She nodded, taking a sip of her coffee. "It's a good habit, I imagine. But you can't plan everything, can you?" she said, more like an observation than a question. "Sometimes, the unexpected can be as valuable as the calculated." I couldn't help but smirk at her words. "I'm not one for leaving things to chance," I replied, but I found myself intrigued by the way she spoke. There was no unnecessary chatter, no small talk, just an easy, effortless understanding. "I understand that," she said quietly, her gaze shifting briefly to the window. "But there's something to be said for letting go of control every now and then. You might find that it's not always the worst thing." We talked for a little while longer, and I found myself relaxing in a way I hadn't done in years. She didn't ask questions about my past, about my personal life, about anything that wasn't relevant to the conversation. She didn't push. She didn't pry. It was a rare thing. Someone who could just exist in the same space without trying to fill every silence with words. Before I left the cafe, I made sure to exchange numbers with her. There was no grand gesture, no overly emotional conversation. Just 2 people recognizing something in each other, an unspoken respect for boundaries, for clarity. As I walked out, I felt a strange sense of peace, one that had been absent for far too long. Back in the city, life returned to its normal pace. Marissa's departure didn't change much of anything. I kept my focus where it needed to be. My firm was growing, and the work was solid. People continued to respect me for my competence, my ability to navigate through the chaos without letting it derail me. And I didn't have to deal with the distractions of someone else's mistakes anymore. Allison and I stayed in touch after that first meeting. We exchanged a few messages here and there, occasionally meeting for coffee when I was in town. She was grounded, self-sufficient, someone who didn't need anyone else to define her. She worked as a veterinarian, running a small practice in the area. It was clear that she valued her independence, but there was an understanding between us, one that didn't need to be explained. It wasn't about rushing into anything or filling some void. It was about a quiet understanding, a mutual respect for each other's space and boundaries. Over time, we met more often, and with each meeting, I found myself feeling something that I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years, a sense of connection. But not in the way I had with Marissa. With Allison, there was no need to prove anything. No games. Just two people who appreciated each other's company without any drama or expectations. In the end, it wasn't about the past. It wasn't about Marissa's affair or the consequences of her choices. It was about where I was now, in control of my own life, my future. I'd moved on, not just from her, but from the entire weight of the situation. The past was a distant memory, and I had built something new, something real, something that worked for me. A few months later, I stood in front of the new office building, the glass reflecting the early morning sunlight, the city skyline stretching out in front of me. It had been a year since everything had fallen apart, since Marissa had left, since I'd watched her try to fix what she had broken, and finally given up when she realized I wasn't playing her game anymore. She tried to reach out a few more times, but I didn't respond. That chapter of my life was closed, sealed, and forgotten. The phone rang in my pocket, and I pulled it out to see who was calling. I didn't recognize the number, but the area code told me everything I needed to know. Marissa. I didn't pick up, just swiped it to voicemail. It wasn't about any kind of closure anymore. That wasn't something she could offer. I didn't need her to make amends. I had already moved on. I glanced down at the phone for a second, then pocketed it and turned back toward the building. Inside, the office was buzzing. My firm had grown significantly over the past few months, and the employees I'd carefully selected had proven their worth. Everything was running like clockwork. I wasn't chasing anything anymore. I had it all. The stability, the control, the respect. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and I stepped inside. I didn't notice anyone waiting, but I saw Allison standing in the corner, her calm presence unmistakable. She was flipping through some paperwork, but when she saw me, she stood up with that quiet confidence I'd come to appreciate. "You're late," I said, keeping it casual, no pleasantries. She glanced at her watch. "You're early. You know I prefer it when you're behind schedule. Gives me time to catch up." I let the words sink in for a moment before replying. "I don't need time to catch up anymore." Allison smirked, like she knew exactly what I meant. "Good," she said, moving over to the desk. "Keeps things interesting." The rest of the day went by like any other, clear, decisive, full of moves that pushed us closer to the next level. I wasn't looking for anything outside of what I had built. Everything was in place. Even Marissa's calls had started to fade into the background, a reminder of how far removed I was from that mess. Later that evening, after work, I met with some of my close associates, people I trusted, people who had helped me get to where I was now. We sat around the table, the discussions sharp, efficient. There were no wasted words, no fake pleasantries. Just business, pure and simple. As the meeting wrapped up, one of the men, a longtime partner, slapped a hand on the table. "You've got it figured out, Reed. You're playing the game on a whole other level now." I didn't respond right away, just let the words hang in the air. The truth was, I wasn't playing the game anymore. I had already won it. After the meeting, I stepped out onto the balcony of the office, the city lights twinkling below me. I didn't need anything else. No grand gestures, no unnecessary apologies from the past. I had already moved past all that. In the quiet, there was a strange peace, a calmness that came from knowing that the path ahead was mine to shape. I had taken control, reclaimed my space, and rebuilt everything from the ground up. There were no more loose ends. Nothing left to prove. The phone buzzed again in my pocket. I didn't even check it this time. I knew who it was, and I knew it didn't matter. Marissa could keep calling, but her voice meant nothing anymore. It wasn't about her anymore. It was about what I had built, what I had worked for, and what I controlled now. I turned back inside, ready for whatever came next. The future was clear, and for the first time in a long while, I knew exactly what it would hold. No distractions, no regrets, just the next step in a life I had shaped on my terms. And that, in the end, was more than enough.